The neon over Miller's diner fought the storm like a stubborn molar. It blinked and buzzed and refused to go out, throwing a thin, jaundiced light across the wet highway. Rain hammered the metal awning in a steady percussion that could have been a drumbeat for an apocalypse, and the town of Grayford hunkered down wherever it could, behind curtains, in old cars, under the overhangs of places that had withstood worse winters. Clare kept the coffee flowing. She had a way of moving through chaos as if it were only another chore. Trays balanced on forearms, orders memorized like prayers, a laugh ready for anyone who looked like they needed one. If people came into Miller's on a Tuesday night, it was because the coffee was good and the pie was honest. And Frank liked his place to feel like an anchor when the weather tried to make the world forget. People could still be kind to each other. Clare finished rinsing a mug and set it to dry, the clink of porcelain bright and domestic against the roar outside. She'd been at Miller's so long, her hands knew the wood of the counter as a pianist's hands know keys. The apron she wore had a pocket that had absorbed so many pens it had its own supply. In it lived a folded receipt she kept for luck, a gum wrapper and a small dented coin. She told herself she'd save for a refill of her tuition. College had been a plan once. It still sat in the back of her head, in the form of a brochure with an old, wrong address. Classes in English and something practical, business maybe, because she liked the idea of starting a cafe that actually had enough lights on to stay open all night. Instead, she worked double shifts, deposited what she could into an account that yielded more hope than interest, and moved through a small-town economy that required patience and a steady heart. Patience and a close eye for storms. The door of the diner sighed open, and a gust of wind sent a shower of cold that smelled like wet asphalt and winter wood. Two silhouettes huddled on the threshold, clothes plastered to their skin. One was small and bent, and carried herself like someone who had learned to fold against the wind. The other was younger, tall enough to block half the doorway with his shoulders, and his hair hung in ropes of wet that made him look as if someone had taken him from the cover of a magazine and dropped him into a war. "Come in, come on!" Frank barked from behind the grill. He had the gruff, grandfatherly voice of a man who hadn't so much lost an edge as found a new use for it. His hair was a white that knew its own worth, his hands burned with grease and competence. He motioned to a booth by the window where a space heater gave off a grateful glow. Clare moved on instinct. She brought 2 steaming mugs and a third plate piled with the diner's best apple pie. The steam carried a scent that could have been a small benediction, warm cinnamon, butter, a promise. The woman who entered with the tall man smiled with eyes that suggested a lifetime of running companies and running late breakfasts. Her cheeks were flushed, not with the storm, but with something steadier, the kind of warmth people earned by insisting on certain things: integrity, flavor, perseverance. Her coat was the good sort of coat, not flashy but built to last. She introduced herself as Rosemary Caldwell when Clare placed the pie before them, and there was a ring to the name that Clare noted the way one notes familiar chords in a song. "You all right?" Clare asked, more out of habit than curiosity. In Grayford, you asked whether the person wanted it or not. Rosemary patted the space beside her. "We'll be all right. We were heading south, but the highway closed. We found a detour, and then the weather did its best to derail any sense of travel." She smiled at the boy, man, beside her, who had not yet said anything. "This is my son Nathaniel. He's a bit damp." Nathaniel's eyes were tired in a way Clare recognized, not the near hysteria tired of someone who'd worked a double cleaning shift, but the bone weariness of a person who'd been told they must hold things together for a very long time. He had a careful jaw and a manner that made people step polite around it, the kind of caution that belonged to people who'd had to calibrate themselves in public for safety. He nodded to Clare once, infrequently, as if he preferred the language of observation over conversation. She poured him coffee. It was nothing to him, she told herself. It was everything to him. she was surprised to notice. He sipped and held the mug with both hands, like he'd been taught to treat heat as something serious and sacred. They began to talk as strangers will, the small talk that becomes real talk when the night stretches and the world above your head rages. "Power's out 2 towns over," Frank said in the conversational way cooks drown in. "Roads are slick. You did good finding shelter." Rosemary laughed, the sound a curated thing that fit oddly in the diner but then didn't. "Shelter's not hard to find when the town's got a place like this. My parents taught me to find the warmth wherever it is." Clare had the impulse to ask about parents, about small-town recipes, to string Rosemary into the map of her own life and piecewise stitch that map with the stranger's edges. She asked instead where they were headed, and the answer was both plain and oddly elaborate. "Home," Rosemary said, and there was an accent to the word not of dialect but of ownership. "We were on our way to our house south of the city. Storm made us rethink." Nathaniel said nothing until Clare handed him a slice of pie too. He had the air of a man who weighed whether his choices would displease some unseen board. He tasted the pie and his face softened like a photograph left in the rain and rescued, a small, private thing made visible. "This is good," he said. It sounded like praise, and, unexpectedly, it was a recognition of what Clare most fiercely believed about the diner. That honesty of flavor was sometimes the only religion Grayford had. Over the next hour, the storm folded them into an unlikely narrative. Trucks pulled into the lot, men in caps and mud-splattered laps. A young mother with 2 kids in rain boots asked for extra blankets. A retired schoolteacher, who had a habit of falling asleep with an open crossword, roused herself and confessed she never could resist a challenge. Clare moved from table to table like a quiet steward, resupplying coffee, swapping stories of the road, keeping the rhythm. Between trips, she found time to sit opposite Nathaniel and talk about things that did not require a resume. "You always work nights?" he asked when the sky mellowed into a torrent. "Mostly," Clare said. It didn't feel like a complaint. It felt like a fact. "You get better tips at 3 a.m. because people have fewer filters." He laughed in a way that almost frightened him, short, surprised. "I wouldn't know. I've been in boardrooms and airports mostly." He shifted, and for a second the man in the jacket looked like someone who had never had to fill a form asking how much rent was. "It's different to sit in a place like this." "Different's not always bad," Clare said. She felt the sentence before she decided to speak it. Sometimes words were tiny bridges you threw across a river. Sometimes different means more pie. The spare humor loosened him. He told her in pieces about long stretches of travel, a childhood spent knowing his mother as both parent and founder of a company called Caldwell Technologies, a name that to Clare felt as far away as a brand on television. He spoke of fatherless lunches and the responsibility that had been folded into him like a promise that couldn't be cancelled. He didn't brag. He joked awkwardly about being intimidated by the jukebox and the newspaper's crossword, and about how his mother had convinced him that apple pie was a universal peace offering in storms. There it was. Rosemary's confidence had a halo of experience, and Nathaniel's deference to his mother was almost reverential. He was guarded, distinctly so, but he also let his guard down by degrees, piece by careful piece, until Clare could see the tender that lay beneath. She found herself telling them small things too, the reason she'd put college on hold, that she and her cousin Jessica pooled rent and dinners, that she saved small amounts for seemingly big dreams. It felt good to not sound like she was explaining herself to someone who'd already decided her worth. "You've got grit," Rosemary observed, when Clare mentioned her savings. There was admiration and a hint of calculation in the way she appraised Clare. And Clare, who had never had anyone important appraise her so plainly, said thank you like it was a gift. Night moved along with an odd intimacy. The storm had a way of making strangers feel like friends in the necessary light of survival. By the time the diner had taken in every stray traveler it could hold, Clare felt as if she'd been part of a small play that only the town could stage. Coffee, shelter, and apple pie that tasted better than it had any business tasting because people remembered how to offer kindness. When Nathaniel stood to leave, he did so with a clumsy elegance. He thanked Clare and Rosemary for the pie and the dry refuge. He left in a rush of movement, a man eager to be on the road again, but also reluctant to commit himself to leaving an easy warmth. The storm had thinned into a sheet of steady rain that made the world feel like an old photograph. Clare watched the door close and the neon halo blink back into its private conversation with the night. She should have gone back to scrubbing mugs, but she lingered at the counter and found herself feeling tender in an unfamiliar way. Some people she served you could hand a coffee and see their lives continue exactly as before. Others left a ripple. Nathaniel left one. When the rush finally ebbed and Frank banked the coffee machine, Clare went about closing, sweeping, stacking, writing down the night's totals. Her apron pocket snagged on something as she reached to restock napkins. She fished with the same absent-mindedness she used to untangle receipts and found, folded into the fabric, a business card. The card was thick and understated, the print precise, and her thumb found the gold embossing like a diviner's needle. The name on it made the diner cease to be only a diner for a heartbeat. Nathaniel Caldwell, Caldwell Technologies, a phone number, an office line. The card bent in her hand as if it carried the weight of a world she had not expected to hold. She felt a flush of something, exposure maybe, or the rising threat of embarrassment. Had she slipped it in without meaning to? Had he meant to hand it to her? It didn't matter how it arrived. It mattered that it had arrived in her apron, because someone else's name now lived in the same fabric as the receipts and the dented coin. She tucked the card into her apron pocket with the offer of secrecy, a small private thing between herself and the night. It felt like a souvenir, a talisman, a test. She told herself she would not look at it again until morning. But mornings in Grayford have a way of pulling truth's surface side, like minnows being chased by something insistent. Clare woke early to the sound of rain slackening, the way a thing exhales after work. She had slept in a chair with her book open on her lap. The essay she read was about margin and art, and how people make themselves into the containers for other people's stories. She packed her bag, wrapped a scarf around her neck, and headed to the back door. The town smelled of wet leaves, and something green trying hard to remember spring. It felt embarrassingly hopeful. Clare's shift began before dawn for the breakfast crowd, and by the time she tied her apron, she had already practiced the smile she would use for the elderly man who liked his eggs sunny and his gossip fresh. She had meant to tuck the card into a drawer, to give it the dignity of being stored, but habit and curiosity conspired, and she palmed it, unfolded it, read the letters, like someone looking for a language that might explain the world's sudden change. Nathaniel Caldwell. Her eyes ticked to the phone number, and then to the logo, a small emblem that belonged in magazines, not in the pocket of her apron. It was ridiculous to feel a jolt from a piece of cardstock, but the jolt came all the same. She had made a place in the world for surprises, and most of them were small and manageable. This was less manageable. It was the kind of thing that rearranged a room by its presence. She tried to pocket the card and be sensible. People across town were the children of other people who had houses and names and jobs that felt like other languages. She could tuck the card away, keep it as proof that a brief kindness had not existed in a vacuum. Or she could pretend she hadn't found it and let the morning be ordinary. She chose ordinary for all of 90 seconds, and then stepped into the front and began to work, carrying the weight of the card like something she'd promised to remember. The morning came with its own cast. Truckers rolled in from the highway, their boots loud and grateful. A young mother with an infant returned, eyes wary but brighter than the night had made them. The retired teacher returned his crossword to the paper and announced with grave satisfaction that he'd missed a clue. Clare took orders, balanced plates, and watched the town rotoscope itself back to its daytime habits. Nathaniel did not appear at first. Later that morning, when the town had recovered from the night's drama and the sky had begun to clear, he returned. This time, he came not as a stranger, but with an address, a gait more deliberate, and a look less like someone who wanted to vanish into the wallpaper. He took the booth he'd occupied the night before, and when he ordered coffee, Clare felt a small, private surge, a recognition that a line had been drawn between them, that she had been given a place in his orbit whether she wanted it or whether she would admit to wanting it. "Back again," Frank said, eyebrows raised as if the man's presence at the counter was a phenomenon worth remarking upon. "I couldn't leave without a proper thank you," Nathaniel said. He sounded unpolished when he tried to be light, like someone who practiced laughter in the mirror and found it didn't always look like the real thing. He reached into his coat and, with a motion that made Clare's stomach do something like a small, surprised flip, he took out his wallet and held up a card, identical to the one that had been in her pocket. "I realized I must have dropped this last night," he said. "I wanted to make sure you had it, in case, if you ever need anything." He gave her a look that required no translation. It was the look of a man who could offer means, and the awkwardness of someone not sure how to make that offer without collapsing into cliché. Clare took the card from him and felt the air between them change yet again. The world had an odd habit of revealing layers only when it had your attention. He was a man with an identity that would, in most towns, shift the axis of gossip on its hinge. He was also the man who had sat hunched over a mug, eyes polite and tired, and who had eaten a slice of apple pie like it was exactly what his body needed. Those two things were not mutually exclusive, and yet the town would not know that without explanation. She smiled. "Thanks," she said. "If I ever need anything, I'll be sure to call the number." Her voice had a level that was part wry, part defensive. She worried that accepting kindness would require her to become lesser, and yet refusing it might mean throwing away a seam of possibility. Nathaniel's smile was quick and real. No pressure, just, "If you ever need someone to pick up a generator or a tow or whatever storms ruin, call me." He gestured at the sky, as if what they'd had to fix that night could be fixed with a phone call and a human being. The offer did not land like an avalanche nor like a dove. It landed like a small bridge being extended. The town took note, as towns do. The clerks who liked a little narrative attached the man to myths. Rich man visits small diner, rich man rescued in storm, rich man buys pie as penance. Frank rolled his eyes and supplied a wry commentary about men in suits who could not stomach uncertain coffee. The retired teacher muttered that the sudden interest in the diner showed that storms made people generous in unpredictable ways. Clare heard the comments like water hitting a roof. They made noise, but did not yet leak into her bones. Nathaniel came back in over the weeks after that first storm, sometimes with his mother, sometimes alone. He kept his phone across the table at first, a small rectangular island between him and Clare, a reminder that he had duties. But with each conversation he moved the rectangle farther away, and sometimes left it buried under a menu or a napkin. He asked her about Jessica. He told her about meeting a man at a gala who believed himself more important than truth. He hated most of what the industry parties demanded, he said. Small talk that asked you to be another person. And he loved small things that were not, at first glance, consequential. He liked coffee, made with a care that did not demand applause. Clare found herself being honest in small increments. She told him about the book she read in the quiet hours, about the characters she loved. She told him once that she wanted to own a tiny cafe that stayed open all night, one that smelled right and served pie the way her grandmother had taught her. Nathaniel listened as if his life had been a puzzle missing a piece, and that somehow, in spite of the weight of his own world, he found room for other people's pictures. It was not romance in the movies, it was a series of small observations, A shared laugh over a burnt batch of toast, an argument over whether the diner's jukebox played the right version of some old song, a quiet moment where his hand brushed hers while passing a napkin, and neither of them moved away. Those touches, ordinary and unremarkable, accumulated like savings. Clare was careful. She had agency and memory. She had been burned by people who offered pity, and then sculpted relationships around it. She was, therefore, both open and guarded. Rosemary watched them with a kind of amused approval. She would arrive by herself sometimes, sit in the booth by the window, and observe Clare at work, a woman who made the world possible with coffee and a steady hand. There was something maternal in the way Rosemary would comment on a good slice of pie, or the way Clare handled cash. She and Clare found themselves in easy repartee. Clare had the impression that Rosemary saw the world as wholly practical and wholly too stubborn to ever be captivated by spectacle alone. She had the kind of affection for Clare that did not need to be loud. It just existed. "You remind me of someone who would have been very annoying if she were any less capable," Rosemary said once, while they watched a couple argue lightly about the merits of the ham plate. "Keep your head down, work hard. Don't let anyone sell you on the idea that your dreams are a hobby they aren't." "Thanks," Clare said. "My cousin says the same thing, but louder." It felt like a slow unwrapping, and Clare let herself be unwrapped in the small ways a person allows themselves to be seen without allowing themselves to be dismantled. Nathaniel's world, when it appeared, did so like a map with parts left uncolored. He would tell her in flashes about shareholder meetings and long flights and the pressure of being a name on a board. He never tried to win her with money. He had the sense to be humble about it, to know that currency could buy things, but not the particular nuances that mattered. Closeness to him felt like a raw and dangerous decision. Then one morning, after a night where the rain had been only polite and the town had been bright and washed, Clare arrived to find a small envelope slid underneath the diner's door. Frank was grumbling that someone had finally started a neighborhood rumor, and the envelope sat like a bold punctuation on the floor. Clare picked it up, half expecting a bill or an advertisement. Instead, the paper was thick and stationery-smelling, the kind of stationery schools of thought used when they wanted their letters to be taken seriously. Inside was a note in handwriting that was not Cyrillic or carved, but simple, precise. It read, "Thank you for the night you gave us. Please accept my mother's gratitude as well as mine. N. Caldwell." Beneath the signature, a card was tucked into the paper, flatter and new, as if it had been pressed between pages that instructed about titles and responsibilities. Clare looked at the card until the ink blurred. The name was the same that had been in her apron and the card in his hand, Caldwell Technologies, and beneath it a line that pinched, Nathaniel Caldwell, Chief Executive Officer. She felt the words settle on her, like an uninvited but not wholly unwelcome fact. The town would reframe him now, she thought. It would take him from being a damp, tired man to being a man who could make phone calls, who could speak to people, who made things happen. People would nod and say, "No surprise, that rich man." People would think of him as a prize. Clare folded the note and put it in her pocket, where the small coin for tuition lived and where the dinner tickets were kept. She told herself she would not change how she acted. She would keep her apron clean, serve the pie with her usual honesty, and not let the world tilt. But the world has gravity. A name like Caldwell has gravity too. Rumors slid into town like the rainwater in gutters. The CEO had been in Grayford. The CEO had eaten pie. The CEO had spoken to a waitress. The local paper, a thin thing with a loyal readership, printed a piece that had the tone of an over-caffeinated reporter discovering a beat. Notable man finds small-town refuge. Small-town girl offers pie. Human interest follows. The piece sat at the edge of Clare's world like a small, noisy animal that demanded feeding. People said things, some affectionate, some speculative. Clare felt the whispers tighten her chest with a sensation that was equal parts ridiculous and heavy. She had been a public person in the small scope of the diner her whole adult life. Everyone knew when she took a day off. Everyone had an opinion on the coffee. Everyone assumed a right to advise. This was different. The world of Caldwell Technologies was a distant ocean, whose tide was now creeping up the beach where she stood barefoot. Nathaniel watched the effect of those ripples with a careful hand. He noticed the way people angled when he entered the diner now, with that particular combination of curiosity and calculation that says, "What could he do for us?" He was plainly embarrassed by some of it. He had never meant to make Clare the center of a town's gossip, but he also, the more she let him in, found himself irritated at a house of cards system that valued spectacle over substance. He didn't understand the social rulebook of small towns well, and Clare did not understand the brutal optics of shareholder meetings and media cycles. It was a distance he would have to bridge if he intended to remain the kind of man who could choose to be with someone like her. Their relationship after discovery became a delicate negotiation. He would bring a bouquet or a magazine he thought she'd like, and she would hand him change and a plate and a conversational challenge about the best thing to order during storms. He would confess in his third person about a board with teeth. She would confess in her first about the brochures she kept folded for a future that felt both near and impossible. Sometimes they talked about serious things, the responsibilities of money, the pressure to allow image to dictate truth. And sometimes they did the simplest, silliest things. He tried to make a milkshake and nearly flooded the kitchen, and she laughed until she couldn't breathe. The town's gossip simmered. Some folks were honest. They liked that Clare had a place to be proud of, and they liked the validation that came with association. Others were quick to judge, as people are trained to do by boredom and bad television. Clare felt the pull of being uplifted and of being turned into a symbol, and she kept asserting her small sovereignty, her bills, her plans, her dreams. She may have been holding a card with a name that made a boardroom sit up and whisper, but she was also the woman who paid rent on time and danced in the alley with Jessica to celebrate a passed test. In the margins of all this, there were quieter moments that imprinted themselves more permanently than any headline. Nathaniel learned to leave his phone in the glove compartment when he took the booth he now seemed to favor. He stopped answering during breakfast, unless it was urgent. He began to listen. Clare loved the way silence could turn into a thing that double-stacked intimacy like plates. One evening, as summer lurched toward fall and the diner smelled of cinnamon and ground coffee, Clare found Nathaniel at the counter again. He was not alone. A grey-suited man sat beside him, his suit pressed and his smile predatory in the way the town had lately taken to calling businesslike. The man's name was, Clare learned that night, Marcus Peterson, and his eyes considered Clare in the way people who skim the surface of others often do, with the intent to catalogue and make decisions about worth. Marcus had charm, like an animal tooth, white and sharp. He had opinions about the menu and about the economic viability of small places. He spoke in that professional tone that transforms curiosity into leverage. Nathaniel's face tightened when Marcus made suggestions about expansion, about the architecture of a brand that might someday include Miller's Diner as a quaint vignette in a glossy corporate brochure. Clare's mouth went flat. Later, when the storm was months old in memory, and the town had made peace with the idea of a billionaire in its monthly rotation, Clare found Marcus's gaze stuck to people like a curator at a gallery. He was polite in a way that made rooms reconfigure around him. He was the signal that careers were being considered and that the weather had other things to worry about. Clare had seen men like him her whole life, men who used language like subterfuge. She had no illusions about the power names carried and was uncomfortably aware of how quickly a person with money could rewrite narratives. She had been kind to Nathaniel without the intention of being anyone's stepping stone. She would not be a symbol unless she chose to be. The storm had changed everything, the title of her story suggested, because it had carried a man into the town, a man who wore a name like a cape. But the storm had also changed something inside Nathaniel. He found that he wanted to be less of the man the world had asked him to be. He found that the diner made speech simpler and truth more accessible. He found that Clare's steady hands were a mirror he had not expected to look into. And Clare kept on working. She learned to fold the card, a talisman, a decision, and keep it in an envelope inside the apron pocket she used to store tips. She kept the coin for tuition. She kept the plan for a cafe in the back of her mind like a map with room for new roads. The diner hummed with ordinary life. Trucks rolled in and out. Frank grumbled about the sugarless coffee at 2 in the morning and then forgot his complaint when someone told a good joke. The retired teacher solved crosswords with the intensity of a man who believed every missing word had a place. Jessica stopped by with stories about her own job and the way she and Clare saved quarters like little votes for the future. Rosemary continued to come, a steady presence that had not lost its authority in the smallest ways. She spoke one afternoon about the early days of her company, about dirt and risk and the smell of weld and the echo of a promise made by two people who believed in making something that could outlast them. "You think money changes people?" Clare asked once, wiping down the counter after a long morning rush. Rosemary set a cup down, with the care of someone who had spent a lifetime measuring things by more than profit. "It changes the choices people can make," she said. "It doesn't make someone kinder or meaner. It gives them options. How they use them says more than having them ever did." Her answer landed like a quiet instruction. Clare kept it. It lodged in her as a principle. Money is a tool, not a definition. She liked that idea, which felt like a small shore to stand upon while the town's tide kept shifting. Then, one bright morning that began unremarkably, Clare found a medium-sized envelope resting on her apartment step. It had no return address and her name written in a careful script. She went inside, turned the lock, and sat with the envelope on her kitchen table. Inside, she found an invitation. The invite was not to a charity gala or a glossy networking event. It was to lunch. A simple line. Nathaniel would like to treat Clare to lunch the following Sunday, if she would accept. He had reserved a place at a cafe in the city where he had business, he wrote, but he wanted to spend the time talking about something that had nothing to do with product launches or quarterly reports. He wanted to talk about pie. Clare laughed out loud, a small, bright sound that woke Jessica from across the hall. "Pie?" Jessica called through the thin wall. "Pie," Clare answered. Then she folded the card into her pocket and remembered the coin, the tuition plan, the brochures. She thought of the diner and how fragile its existence felt, but she also thought of the way Nathaniel had learned to put his phone aside. He had a language for shoring up things with his hands. She had a language for shoring up things with patience. Maybe they could learn each other. She should have said no, she told herself. She had bills that took precedence over spontaneous lunches. She had boundaries set carefully like little fences made to keep her heart intact. But there was something in her that favored ordinary risk. She could go for lunch and walk away. She could go and return to her life. She could allow the conversation and the meal to be exactly what they were, a meal and a conversation. Sunday came like a clockwork mercy. The city smelled of coffee and oil and urgency. Nathaniel's chosen place had white tablecloths and a bracing kind of calm. He was there before her, the man with neat hair and a hand that fidgeted with the menu out of habit. He stood when she arrived and offered a hand that harnessed both gentleness and gravity. He did not offer to pay for everything with the casualness of the entitled. He offered it with the disarming awkwardness of someone trying to learn a new script. They ate slowly. He asked about the diner in ways that were not merely curiosity about a brand. He asked about her dreams in a way that assumed they were real and feasible, and that someone like him could, if he chose to, be helpful without rewriting the premise of her life. Clare explained her plan for the cafe, for nights lit and smell warm, and she watched as he listened, like someone taking notes on a delicate plan. There were moments of quiet, the kind that seemed to be hollow until you put something inside them. He told her, in the distracted honesty of someone changing, about the way business meetings hollowed people. He told her about his fear of being used, and in his vulnerability there was a human ache that required something resembling rescue. Not rescue by money, she realized, but rescue by presence. He wanted someone who would stay when it was easier to leave. At the end of lunch, as they walked back toward a street where the city was its brisk self, Nathaniel stopped in front of a boutique bakery and looked at her with a resolve she'd come to recognize as honest. "Clare," he said, and his mouth made the name as if it were a small treasure. "I know everything about me could be a lot. I don't want you to feel like you're suddenly auditioning for a role you didn't sign up for. I like you because of the way you see things. I like the way you care. I know I don't have the right to expect anything, but if you ever—" He looked like someone fighting gravity. There was a softness in his mouth that made her heart twinge and her strength flex in a new way. She looked at him and felt a tangle of possibility and caution. "Don't promise me things," she said gently. "Promise me honesty. I'll take honesty. I'll take presence more than anything." He agreed. They walked on, both quiet as people who had stepped from one climate into another and had to reorganize their layers. That night, Clare came home and set the card on her kitchen table beside the dented coin. She laid a small hand over it and allowed herself to imagine a future that didn't involve miracles, but involved small, steady accumulation of trust. She read until her eyelids grew heavy and dreamed of light fixtures in a cafe that hummed the way Miller's did when the coffee machine was finally quieting down. What she did not know, could not yet know, was that the ripple the storm had started was not done. A man with charm and edges named Marcus already had an eye for opportunistic shapes. Boardrooms leaned like hungry animals in corporate lobbies. The town would not remain a benign stage forever. The story of a billionaire sitting in a small diner, a curious headline, and a half-true rumor would be the thing that started a quiet avalanche of consequences. Marcus Peterson noticed first. He noticed everything that could be noticed, and then some. The way attention bent a person into profitable angles, the way gossip could be turned into leverage, the way a name like Caldwell could be pulled through a mud of optics and attention until something brittle broke. He had not meant to be cruel. It was simpler than that. He meant to be strategic. He had been hired to make the company impervious to sentiment and to shore up its reports, and he had learned how much easier it was to build power if you made people afraid of losing it. In his corner office, where the city's light flattened into glass and paper, Marcus began to assemble a portrait of risk that fit neatly into the size of his ambition. He ran scenarios in his head, shareholder narratives, press cycles, the cost of an executive seen as distracted, and he solved them the only way he knew how, by moving pieces until the picture favored him. If a rumor could be shaped into a scandal, if a ledger could be nudged to look sloppy at a particular line, then perhaps Nathaniel Caldwell could be nudged into stepping back long enough for Marcus to be seen as the reliable choice to stand in. He did not make the changes in a single cinematic act. He worked with nuance, an altered memo here, a misfiled invoice that appeared in a vendor's name there, private emails selectively forwarded to a freelance journalist with a nose for human interest if there is controversy. He purchased data, small fragments that, when assembled, suggested neglect rather than calculation. He leaned on a junior compliance officer who owed him a favor from an older project. He cultivated Richard Hartley on the board, with pleasant lunches and carefully timed praise. Everything Marcus did was a series of little deceptions that, bundled together, might look like a pattern. Nathaniel saw the first ripple of Marcus's work as the vague ache of someone getting a paper cut they didn't notice until later. A minor discrepancy was flagged in the international supply accounts. An invoice that paid more than it should have, routed through a vendor that no one could quite recall approving. The compliance team sent up the red kite of an internal review. The press amplified the shape of the kite into a story about a distracted CEO and a potential misuse of funds. Shareholders nudged the board with anxious emails. Someone wrote an op-ed pondering whether a CEO's personal life could be a liability. The tide rose in small, humiliating splashes. Nathaniel's instinct was to fix. He thought he could answer questions, put out facts, let the numbers speak for themselves. But the problem with numbers is they are patient but not persuasive. They don't tell a story about character, and the story that mattered now was about character. Marcus fed that hunger for a story. He suggested, quietly, practically, that Nathaniel take a temporary step away while the review completed. He framed it as maturity, as prudence. He delivered the idea with a voice polished from years of negotiations that included people's livelihoods as chess pieces. Nathaniel heard a suggestion and felt it descend into an expectation. He feared that refusal would read as denial. He feared that his presence might become the nail that chipped shareholder confidence. He feared that the association with Clare, the diner, the small-town humanizing narratives would be used against him to say he had been careless. He did not want to be the reason a company he loved was questioned. He did not want to be the cause of anyone losing their job. So he agreed to a temporary leave. He described it, in the public statement, as a pause to assist with an internal review. And he stepped back in a way that felt like removing a limb. He told Rosemary. She listened and said nothing at first, which scared him more than anger might have. He thought he was doing the responsible thing. Marcus thought he had purchased a path to influence. Clare watched through the window of her own life as these quiet tectonics shifted. It was not dramatic at first. There was no single headline that declared ruin. There were instead the small, insistent things that accumulate into mistrust. Fewer visits, a phone call that turned into an apology about being unreachable, whispers at the counter that she had been used or seen to be used. People who meant well asked if perhaps she had been naive. People who meant less asked if she had been paid. None of it asked for the context she lived in. The nights she worked, the money she scraped together, the dignity she insisted upon. She tried to let the rumors be something that happened outside her skin. She reminded herself of Rosemary's words. Money changes choices, not character. She told herself to keep the apron on and the coin safe and the brochures folded as they were. But the town had a way of turning curiosity into pressure. Conversations that had once been friendly edged toward the transactional. Regulars who once joked about burned toast now asked if she had gone to the city for meetings. The local paper printed an op-ed that suggested the CEO had been played by a small-town romance. Frank grunted and said, "People always want to make a story where none exists." But even Frank's jokes could not keep the ache out. For Clare, the most unbearable part was not the gossip. It was the way people's eyes measured her now, as if they were weighing her like a scale labeled opportunity or problem. It felt like a proposal she had never signed. She had offered kindness in a storm, not an audition. The thought of being seen as a prize or a character in a morality tale made her feel small in ways money could not fix. Then Nathaniel became quieter than the town could accommodate, not simply physically absent, but emotionally receding. His attempts to explain were clumsy, full of boardroom euphemisms. He said, "I have to deal with this properly," and "it's for the company." There were nights his voice was raw, and other nights he made excuses about late meetings. She could hear frustration in him and translate it to fear. Fear of losing the company, fear of losing reputation, fear he would be judged by the people who had never had to prove their worth to a creditor at month's end. Clare tried to be patient, but patience is not an inexhaustible resource. She felt herself being asked to assume the moral labor of waiting, waiting for him to clarify, waiting for his world to settle, waiting for the storm to pass. She had done unpaid waiting before. She knew the shape it carved in one's ribs. She had plans for her life that required steps and cash and applications that had deadlines. She had an offer from a community college in Chicago, an evening certificate in hospitality management connected to microloans for small business startups. Jessica pushed for it, saying it was the kind of chance that nudged at a life and made it possible. It would mean leaving the diner for a time, but it could be the real work that moved her forward. The day she left Grayford, the sky was the color of old milk, neutral, unweeping. She packed in practical layers, a warm sweater, the coin tucked into a small box that she kept hidden in a sock, the brochures she had kept. She said goodbye to Frank, with a squeeze that had more gratitude than she could say aloud. Jessica insisted on driving her to the bus station and loaded her with sandwiches and gossip that sounded like comfort. "Promise me you won't sign anything because someone calls you a charity case," Jessica said in the cramped back of the car, slapping Claire's knee in a ritual of love. "I won't," Claire promised. "But I will accept help that lets me stand on my feet." She boarded the bus with a small knot of dread and possibility. The town receded like a photograph you fold, its details smoothed away. She told herself she was going for school, for training, for a step toward a cafe whose lights would not go out. She told herself it had nothing to do with Nathaniel's choices. It did. It had everything to do with her choices. Rebecca Caldwell, no, Rosemary Caldwell, did not wait passively while things twisted. She did not sit like an ornamental founder watching her grandson's life be reshaped by rumor. She had built the company out of elbow grease and early mornings, and she had not done so to see it slip away because of a man with a clever mouth. There were things she had learned, how to read financial reports with an eye that found holes like thorns, how to listen to auditors and separate theater from proof. Her experience was not a sentimental relic. It was a set of tools. She called in favors she had earned. She ordered an independent forensic audit quietly, the way someone might mark a compass correct without making a scene. She sat in a small office and read the reports with a steady hand, headings and numbers bleeding into meaning. Marcus had been careful, but not careful enough. The audit found emails that had been forwarded to reporters with threads culled out of context. It found vendor invoices that had been passed through a shell company with a name that suggested international reach, but traced back to a mailbox in a commercial plaza. It found a trail of approvals that featured Richard Hartley's signature, where a second signature should have been. Rosemary made herself the recipient of evidence. She walked into the boardroom with a stack of paper that felt like a folder of bones. That morning, the board seemed everything executive meetings were, a table that spoke of power, men and women who had learned to make polite faces at the admission of failure. Marcus looked composed, as though he had never expected to be accused. Richard Hartley looked thin at the edges, like someone realizing he had borrowed more than his conscience could repay. Rosemary did what she had always done. She spoke plain. She presented the audit's findings and did not allow the room to be distracted by the usual fog of defenses. She put each piece of evidence on the table in order, the emails forwarded with edited threads, the invoices that showed duplicate payments, the signature trails that suggested one man had been given a map to reroute funds. She did not scream or demand revenge. She asked for accountability. She asked for the company to reflect back its values and to be more honest than it had been. Marcus tried to pivot. He smiled with a practiced charm and blamed oversight and systems. He blamed the complexity of a global organization. He told the board gently that changes were hard and that reputations were fragile. He attempted to make his actions a casualty of necessary roughness, the sort of language executives use when they hope people will confuse force for competence. But the evidence had a different gravity. It bore the weight of documentation. Marcus's narrative could not stand where the paper insisted otherwise. Richard Hartley was forced to admit his role. He had signed where he should not have and had taken shortcuts rather than ask for explanations. The board voted to suspend Marcus pending further legal inquiry. The company initiated a public statement that outlined an internal review and promised transparency. Nathaniel, whose name had been dragged into the churn, stepped back publicly with dignity, an apology that placed responsibility where it belonged and invited scrutiny rather than defensiveness. The victory was not theatrical. Marcus did not fall like a villain in a melodrama. He was taken through the procedural steps that ensured consequences and preserved the company's integrity. Legal counsel was involved. The local press covered the boardroom meeting with the pragmatic tone of people describing the contours of accountability rather than the tragic arc of a single villain. Shareholders were reassured. Stock responded. The tide receded slightly, but it left behind an altered shoreline, and yet the specific shore Clare needed to be washed back onto was not the same as the one Nathaniel stood upon. He had been humbled publicly, but privately he had been wounded in ways a public statement could not mend. Clare had already taken the bus to Chicago. She had, in the days after she left, started her evening classes and taken the subway to a job at a small catering company that paid by the hour. She lived in a room with thin walls and stronger coffee. She learned the rhythm of the city, the way it demanded currency and patience in equal measure. Nathaniel watched the boardroom fight and felt victory wash over him with a thin aftertaste. He had the relief of being believed by the people who knew how to read numbers, but he had, simultaneously, the sense that he had failed Clare. He had stepped away at the moment she might have needed him, not to fix her bank account or to buy her a life, but to stand facing the things that had hurt her reputation. He had allowed the rationality of governance to crowd out the human element of accompaniment. He booked the next flight to Chicago as if catching a train would mend what he had broken. He did not want to use wealth as a bludgeon. He wanted to use it to be accountable, to show he could do better by actually changing behaviors that had caused harm. He thought at length about what that meant, small, tangible acts rather than grand gestures. He planned not a spectacle but a series of consistent choices, an invitation into slow change. He found Clare in a second-floor classroom one rainy evening, carrying a tote bag that smelled faintly of yeast and determination. She had just finished a night shift at the catering company and had crawled into a seat at the back, tired but present. When he stepped into the doorway, he felt his throat close and his chest do the thing it had done months earlier in that diner, tighten and open in the same movement. "Clare," he said, and his voice was a sort of quiet plea. He had not rehearsed it in any way that made it more graceful. He looked at her, really looked, and then said, "I shouldn't have let politics and optics tell me how to act toward you. I should have been clearer. I should have been here." She kept her hands folded over a workbook and measured him. There were many things she had not forgiven him for: the public distance, the subtle humiliation of gossip, the sense that she had been a footnote in a crisis. But she also knew what it meant when someone became vulnerable and honest in front of you. She had seen enough of human weakness and courage to know the difference between a man trying to buy forgiveness and a man offering himself as accountable. "You should have asked me what I wanted," she said. "You should have called me and said, 'I am sorting this. I might be needed where I am, but I don't want you to think you're being used.' Instead, you stepped back and let other people decide the story about me." Nathaniel's face crumpled in a way that was not melodramatic but real. "You're right. I thought I was protecting you. Stupid, right? I thought if I stepped away it would stop hurting you. It did the opposite. I'm sorry. They talked for a long time about small things and large things. Nathaniel did not offer riches as apology. He offered time. He offered to reduce his public profile. No more lavish gestures, no more social media pronouncements about charity. He offered to introduce Clare to people who might help her career, but said he would do so only with her permission and on her terms. He spoke about implementing a board-level transparency initiative that would prevent unilateral actions like Marcus's from being possible in the future. He told her he had sought counseling to manage the weight of leadership without allowing it to hollow him out. He promised to be accountable in measurable ways, fewer late-night flights, more check-ins with his board beyond rote statements, a commitment to not allow others to tell his personal story for him. Clare listened. She was cautious because caution had preserved her before. She also felt the small, persistent ember of something she had let grow the first night with the pie and the coffee, a person who had seen her, not an image of her. She agreed to meet him slowly, on the condition that honesty would be the rule, and that she would not be expected to repair all at once. They agreed to text, rather than have calls where tone could be misread. They agreed that Nathaniel would come to Chicago not to declare grand plans, but to help with concrete tasks, perhaps a meeting with a business counselor, perhaps a tour of a small batch roaster that could supply Clare's future cafe. When Clare set the terms, it was not a capitulation. It was a contract she wrote on the fly. She asked for consistency. Show me by keeping small promises, not by promising big rescues. She asked for respect for her independence. If you want to help me start my cafe, fine, but I will be the one to make the plan and the payments. If you want to invest, it will be as a lender with terms I accept or a partner with a clear role, not a savior. Nathaniel agreed, and in that agreement there was an adultness she had not expected. He did not ask for immediate forgiveness. He asked for the chance to rebuild. Marcus's fall had consequences beyond the boardroom. He fought tooth and nail, of course. He hired lawyers. He crafted a narrative about misunderstanding. He appealed to nuance. He tried to reclaim the ground he thought his career deserved. But legal processes are slow and exacting, and evidence is a stubborn thing. He was suspended, investigated, and, when the work of accountability was done, dismissed. He was given the chance to seek rehabilitation through compliance programs and an exit plan that guarded the company from litigation, but did not wash away the fact of his wrongdoing. He was less a melodramatic villain than a man whose ambition had outpaced his ethics. In the months that followed, the company did what it should have done in the face of a scandal. It strengthened internal controls. It made transparent who could sign what. It appointed an independent compliance officer whose sole job was to report irregularities without fear. Nathaniel, in the mode of someone unwilling to be hollowed by power again, stepped up into a role that intentionally reduced his flair for control and increased his discipline in governance. He did not abdicate leadership, but he learned to lead with oversight. Rosemary watched all this with a stoic pride that softened into something like relief. She loved the company like a child and hated seeing it taught hard lessons by malice. Her relationship with Clare had moved from curious to sincere. She had seen in Clare the same stubborn competence she had once possessed. When Clare returned to Grayford in the winter to visit after a semester in Chicago, Rosemary presented her with a book, a ledger bound in leather, the kind of practical thing that suggested, record your plans, make them real. She placed it in Clare's hands with the kind of blessing older women give, wordless, full of faith in work. Clare's cafe did not open because a billionaire bought the property and signed away her dignity. It opened because she did the work. Business plan, a small SBA loan that she qualified for with the help of a local microfinance advisor, a partnership with Jessica, who agreed to manage evening shifts while Clare oversaw operations. Nathaniel introduced her to a local accountant and to a roaster who offered wholesale discounts in exchange for consulting on quality. But all of these were invitations Clare accepted on her terms. She negotiated the loan, she learned marketing, she painted the walls herself. Her parents stitched a sense of pride into months that were financially lean but emotionally rich. Nathaniel never tried to erase the differences between their lives. He refused to be a deus ex machina. Instead, he learned to use his resources in a way that honored Clare's agency. He provided a small, no-string seed grant from a foundation he set up in his grandmother's name that supported women-owned small businesses. He made sure it was administered through an independent non-profit that checked business plans and honored independence. He supported the cafe's supplier agreements by opening his company's procurement network to local businesses, helping Clare find suppliers without taking ownership. To Clare, these gestures mattered not because they were generous, but because they respected the rules she had set. They rebuilt their relationship the way someone might restore a house, careful, deliberate, paying attention to the structure beneath the plaster. There were missteps. He would sometimes forget a promise and need to be reminded. She would sometimes assume he would step in and find his disappointment when he didn't. They negotiated boundaries. His public life would be managed to avoid splashes that would turn personal into political, and her independence would be honored so that she remained the manager of her dreams and not an accessory to his wealth. There was a tenderness in the repair that had nothing to do with spectacle. Nathaniel learned to make coffee the way Clare liked it. He learned the names of sources and the way Clare said, "No sugar," like a small ritual. Clare learned the patience of waiting for a board meeting to pass, of attending shareholder sessions where she watched Nathaniel answer questions with a new humility. They took small trips that were not announcements, picnics in a park, an afternoon at a used bookshop where she picked out a copy of a cookbook and he paid with the exact change she had wanted to give. Those moments layered into a trust that was not instant but accrued. Marcus's departure opened a space for other kinds of company governance. The board, chastened, appointed a committee on ethics that included community voices. Governance became less a buzzword and more an operational ethic. Nathaniel accepted this not as humiliation, but as a learning curve in stewarding what his family had built. There were days when Clare wondered if the storm had been a necessary cruelty, the rough thing that made all possibilities visible. She knew storms did not always carry gifts. Sometimes they only left wreckage. But the storm that brought Nathaniel to Miller's had done something else. It had presented her with a choice point, a moment where kindness and risk collided. She had acted out of a simple human impulse to help. That act had not been transactional. It had been catalytic. It had set in motion events that required pain and accountability, but it had also produced growth. By the time Clare's cafe opened, the town had a new place to gather and new reasons to believe in small beginnings. The grand opening was modest. Jessica hung a hand-painted sign, Frank came with a pie he insisted on offering for free, and Rosemary sent an arrangement of flowers in a simple vase. Nathaniel stood at the back of the room, hands tucked into his coat pockets, watching as Clare moved among guests, like someone who belonged to every table because she had served them. He watched her kiss her mother on the cheek, her mother who had travelled up from a nearby town, and he felt privately that the work of loving her demanded both humility and quiet joy. They built rituals that helped them stay honest. A Sunday walk when the city permitted, a monthly dinner at Miller's where Clare could be with her old regulars without fanfare, a quarterly meeting where Nathaniel updated her on company matters that might impact her life. They didn't pretend the lines between their worlds were erased, they learned to navigate them. Nathaniel increasingly took public positions that emphasized the human cost of corporate decisions and the importance of building companies that did not outsource ethics for profit. Clare leaned into her studies and her work, and the cafe became a physical testament to what labor and modest savings can do when supported by community. Rosemary, older but still stubborn, as the day she had wired machinery into a fledgling plant, watched with that particular blend of grandmotherly pride and executive caution. She and Clare had a new friendship, one built on mutual respect rather than patronage. The founder had found in Clare the kind of loyalty that could not be bought, and in Clare she found a useful ally who tested rhetoric against practice. There were small tests along the way. A trade magazine wrote an op-ed praising corporate philanthropy, and someone suggested Clare's cafe was a public relations play. Clare answered in person. She invited the skeptical writer for coffee and a tour. She showed the books and the payroll and the bank statements. She explained the loan terms. The writer left with a different story that acknowledged the messy, ongoing nature of change. Months later, in a quiet scene that felt like the closing of a chapter rather than the climax of a movie, Miller's Diner hosted a small celebration for Clare. They had no official ribbon cutting, too ostentatious for Grayford, but they had pies, and the jukebox was wound to a cheerful station, and the neon over the diner hummed as if content to emit its jaundiced light into a safer night. Nathaniel came with a small bouquet, a thrift store find, and not an expensive arrangement, and left it on the counter where Clare could see it while she refilled coffee cups. Rosemary sat at the booth she favored, watching Clare move. She said to Nathaniel, not unkindly, "You did the right thing eventually." He looked at her, grateful, and gave a quiet nod that signified more than words. Clare wiped a plate and looked up, meeting Nathaniel's eyes. They had learned, between the storm and the present, that kindness could change a life, but that kindness insisted upon fidelity and labor to be sustained. The billionaire in tow had not been a wand that fixed things. He had been a man who had to relearn how to be human in the face of consequences. Clare had not been a story to redeem him. She had been a person who chose, on her terms, how to build alongside him. When the last of the regulars left and the coffee machine ticked itself into a resting hum, Clare and Nathaniel sat at the counter. No cameras were trained on them. No social feed demanded performance. They shared a slice of a new pie Rosemary had insisted on testing, and talked about mundane things. Flights Nathaniel had cancelled, classes Clare had passed, a small leak in the kitchen sink that always needed mending. Their conversation moved in the comfortable way of people who had carried burdens and placed them down together. "Do you ever think," Nathaniel asked quietly, stirring his coffee without looking up, "that maybe the storm was an ugly way of making us honest?" Clare considered it. She had her own theology of unpredictability. She kept the coin for reasons that felt equal parts superstition and strength. "Maybe," she said, "or maybe it just gave us a chance. We still had to choose how to use it." He nodded. "I'm glad you chose to help." She smiled. "I could say the same." Outside, rain began again, a softer drizzle that made the neon bleed into the street in a watercolor of light. They sat in a pocket of warmth while the town breathed around them. The life that had once been ordinary for Clare, the one that began and ended with the diner, had stretched. It had not been replaced so much as expanded. Nights in Chicago and Saturdays at the cafe, shareholder calls and soup on a winter afternoon for Rosemary. They had learned to bend without breaking. Some months later, as winter powdered the edges of the town and the lights took on a sharper glow, a small gathering convened at the cafe. Friends from Grayford and colleagues from the company filled the space with low chatter. There was a sign on the wall in Clare's handwriting, "For those who make community." Nathaniel stood and said a few words, not a speech, but a recognition of work done and the people who had made it possible. He spoke of transparency and of the way businesses needed to be accountable, and then he turned the floor over to Clare to talk about the cafe's mission. Clare spoke plainly. She told a story about a storm and a diner and how a small act of shelter had become the doorway to many things. She did not dramatize Nathaniel's role. She credited the community and the work. She ended by saying she would keep the cafe a place that served more than coffee. It would serve the kind of space where people could be treated like the sum of their choices rather than the shape of their rumour. After the crowd thinned, Nathaniel walked Clare to the door. He took her hand with a gentleness that had been tempered by failure and learning. "I know I can't erase how things began," he said, "but I can keep showing up in ways that matter to you." She squeezed his hand back. "Keep showing up," she said, "but keep showing up the way we agreed. I don't need a headline. I need a partner who keeps small promises." He smiled. Small promises kept. Big promises never asked for. They kissed then, not in a way meant to be the finale of a movie, but in a real, present moment that tasted of coffee and cold air and the slow accrual of trust. When they parted, the night was sharp and honest. Back at Miller's, Frank washed a last dish and shook his head with his usual exasperated affection. "Storms," he said to nobody and everybody, "bring folks together and pull them apart. It's the tending that counts." Rosemary, having ridden out another season, placed a hand on Clare's shoulder and said, "You did the work, child. You kept your coin, your dignity, and your plan." Clare looked at her, grateful, remembering the night she had given shelter and the ways that act had altered both of their trajectories. She had begun the story a waitress, steady, practical, financially fragile at times, but resolute in her plans. The storm had changed everything, yes. It had carried a billionaire in tow, but it had also carried choice, consequences, and an invitation to a life that required both generosity and boundaries. She had not been saved by wealth, nor had she been made small by attention. She had been invited into a new life she had helped build. The diner's neon hummed on, a stubborn, familiar beat, and Clare busied herself refilling the sugar jar as snow started to smear the edges of the windows outside. Inside, people warmed themselves on coffee, pie, and the steady knowledge that kindness could begin something larger than itself, and that keeping what began required work, honesty, and the courage to keep showing up. If this story stayed with you, or if you believe small acts can change the course of a life, leave a comment below with the word destiny. It's nice to remember that storms bring more than they take, and that sometimes the person you least expect to change your world is the one who hands you a warm cup and a piece of pie.